Do you have student loan debt weighing you down? Well, if you haven't already, you can now apply to have up to $10,000 in federal loans erased. If you're a low-income student who received Pell Grants, it's also possible that you qualify for loan cancellation of up to $20,000. There are some exceptions if you make over a certain income or have specific private loans, but most borrowers who need this relief do qualify. Sandy Baum is an expert on higher education and says these exceptions are important because not every person who has loans really needs this government aid.
People think of the typical borrower as some struggling person, but in fact, the typical borrower, there are borrowers who are struggling for sure, but a large share of and growing share of the debt is held by people who went to graduate school. Borrowing among undergraduates is strictly limited by the federal government, but graduate students can borrow sort of an infinite amount. And every year, half of the federal loans go to graduate schools. Federal loans for students go to graduate students. So more and more of the debt is held by people who went to graduate school. And what you find is that less than 10% of borrowers owe $100,000 or more, but they owe about a third of the outstanding debt. So if you forgave all of the debt, it would disproportionately go to these people who have huge debts and went to graduate school, a small number of people. About a third of borrowers owe less than $10,000. And for them, I mean, they have small debts, but many of them dropped out of college after a short period of time, and they may be struggling. They cumulatively owe just a tiny, tiny percent of the debt. So they don't owe much of the debt, but there are a lot of them.
Baum is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center on Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute, a nonpartisan research nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. In whole, student loans in the U.S. have ballooned to $1.7 trillion, with more than 43 million people in debt. Baum points out that while graduate students do hold a large proportion of this overall debt, this population is also more likely to graduate with a relatively high income.
Graduate students pay back their loans at much higher rates than people who have only undergraduate loans. So the problem with repayment is not primarily among graduate students. Default rates are much higher for people with very small amounts of debt than they are for people with high amounts of debt. That said, there has been an increase in failure to repay among people with graduate debt because we now lend them infinite amounts of money. And so even if you have a pretty good income, if you borrowed, $400,000, you might struggle. So it's not that it's never a problem. I mean, I think people go to law school, they borrow a lot of money, they think they'll be a lawyer, they'll be rich, and many lawyers are not rich. That said, graduate students are much more successful in repaying their loans, and the default rate among graduate students remains significantly lower than the default rate among, for example, people who went to college for a short time and left without any credential at all.
In reality, there's a much larger population of people with smaller loans that can't pay them back for various reasons. In fact, the average borrower has close to $29,000 outstanding, according to the Federal Reserve. And while this recent announcement by the Biden administration cancels a portion of money owed, there are still many Americans who owe upwards of $40,000, $50,000, or even $60,000. This has created a tricky situation, with many people chiming in with different viewpoints. Some borrowers feel that the government should have forgiven more than $10,000, while others who didn't go to college or already paid off all their student loans feel left in the dust.
Most of the lowest income people who are struggling the most financially these days didn't go to college at all. And if you didn't go to college, you don't have student debt. You didn't go to college because you couldn't afford it, you don't have student debt. So, if we wanted to give money to everybody, that would be one thing. But what we're saying is let's give money to some people, but if you didn't go to college, you don't get any of the money. And that's really not fair. Now, what the Biden administration did, they in many ways made the policy better than it might otherwise have been. One is they didn't listen to the calls to forgive $50,000 in debt. They said what we're going to do is forgive $10,000 for everybody who has debt. And a very important thing that they did was to say that they would forgive more of the debt for people who were Pell Grant recipients when they were in college. In other words, people who had low incomes, came from low income households when they were in college, get more debt forgiveness. And that's really important because really those people, didn't get as much aid as they should have from the federal government. It's like retroactively increasing their Pell Grant.
On top of the increased cancellation amount for Pell Grant recipients, President Biden has pushed out new plans that specifically help students who need more financial aid. One ongoing initiative is to make community colleges more affordable or even free. The second aims to double the maximum size of Pell Grants each low-income borrower can receive.
We should definitely increase the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is the federal program that provides grant aid to low and moderate income students. It's targeted. You don't get it if you have a very high income. It's based on people's incomes, and it puts money in people's pockets to allow them to pay for college. But it's not enough. And if we increase the Pell Grant, we could do that, targeting aid and making college more affordable for everyone in a low-income household. The program probably needs some tweaking to make it more effective, but that would be a very good solution.
But there's still much more that can be done to make higher education more affordable and accessible to all. Another area that Baum highlights is the importance of improving financial aid at the state level. Right now, the quality of these programs varies widely state to state.
States spend a fair amount of money on need-based grant aid as well, but some states don't do that. Some states have very small grant programs. Some states base their aid on high school achievement rather than on financial circumstances. Need-based aid is very effective because it puts money in the pockets of the students who need it. If you lower tuition overall for everyone, then you're like distributing the money equally to everyone regardless of their financial circumstances, and not everyone needs that money. So state and federal need-based grant aid is a terrifically important strategy for making college more financially feasible for students who face real constraints.
There's no easy fix to this higher education cost conundrum. Most likely we'll need a variety of solutions to address each source feeding into this problem. This includes improving policies and systems at the government and university level, but also better preparing students at every rung of the ladder from K through 12. Without some big changes, education experts are saying that the U.S. will be back at the same debt level within 4 or 5 years. Stay tuned next week in the first half of Viewpoints for Part 2 on this topic. We'll touch on more proposed solutions and what students and parents should know before heading into those key college years. To find out more about our guest, Sandy Baum, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
If someone demonstrates financial needs, they should not be required to borrow anything. It should entirely be with grants.
Continuing the conversation about a lack of affordability in higher education. Then,
would you put a pet to sleep for a significant amount of money? Or would you alter or rework your child's college application if you thought it would get them into a college that they wouldn't otherwise get into?
Asking ourselves the difficult questions. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.